Hey Script Apart listeners, how are we all doing today? Welcome back to another episode of this podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and today on the show, an emotional conversation about one of the biggest animations of the last 12 months, which was recently nominated for 3 Academy Awards. Across the last few years, a question has emerged in the film industry. How should Hollywood respond to the looming climate crisis? Can blockbuster movies be a tool for mobilising audiences into action as global temperatures rise, fires rage, and climate denialism continues to spread? Maybe in decades to come, The Wild Robot, a film by my guest today, Chris Sanders, will be looked back upon as one of the first indicators of mainstream movie making's processing of and pushback against the weather emergencies coming our way. The film is a stunning Miyazaki-inspired animation about a robot washed ashore on an island in a future America devastated by unspecified ecological disasters. It acknowledges what awaits if carbon emissions aren't curbed head-on, instead of just alluding to it like many other blockbusters. This deeply moving tale features the voice talents of Lupita Nyong'o as Roz, an android who learns to love through foster care. After an accident, she becomes the guardian of an infant goose named Brightbill, voiced by Kit Connor. Brightbill has to learn to fly to migrate to warmer climes before the brutal winter turns the island into a scarcely survivable tundra of sorts. In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, Chris reveals the meaning of 2 phrases that informed every frame of this brilliant film: kindness as a survival skill and exceed your programming. We get into the truth behind Universal Dynamics, the shadowy company that created Roz. Chris shares his advice for any other screenwriters hoping to make effective climate fiction. And you'll also hear a very affecting story that I'm not sure Chris has shared before, about his mother and a regret that he's carried with him for most of his life that ended up influencing one of the key lines in the movie. A massive thank you to Chris, and a massive thank you to all our Patreon supporters who help this show continue to grow. If you'd like ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests, and access to our brand new writing hour, in which Script Apart listeners join me for 60 minutes of creative writing every Saturday, all you need to do is head to patreon.com/scriptapart. That address one more time is patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, with that all out the way, let's jump in, shall we? This is the fantastic Chris Sanders discussing the first draft secrets of The Wild Robot. A massive thanks to everyone for tuning in. My name's Al Horner. This episode was produced as ever by Camille Demek. I hope you enjoy the show. Chris, how you doing? Great to meet you.
Good to meet you. Hello.
Congratulations on The Wild Robot and all its recent award success. Very exciting. I wanted to begin today, Chris, by asking about your first conversation with Peter Brown about this adaptation, and a phrase he used that you immediately jotted down: kindness as a survival skill. What does that phrase mean to you, Chris, and how did it become one of the driving philosophies of this film?
I'm so grateful for the conversation we had. He was very busy working on the illustrations for his 3rd book, so he wasn't able to be there in person when we began. So we got on the Zoom call, and I didn't really even know what to ask. It was Jeff Herman, our producer, and myself, and we just wanted to chat with him about like everything, and just like ask him anything about the story that we may not know yet. And that's when he laid that on us. And it was so clearly a load-bearing guiding principle inside the story. And I wrote that again. You're completely correct. I quickly jotted that down and thought, that was never memorialized in the book. It was just something that he had in his mind as a guiding principle as he wrote the book. So I jotted that down and determined immediately that that would be on screen. And eventually I handed that to the character of Fink, the fox, as he's having a conversation with Roz, and just flat out says, look, you got to learn how things work on this island, and kindness is not a survival skill. And he's saying it as he's killing a crab for his dinner. and graphically illustrating what he's talking about. Um, so that there was two things that were our North Star, if you will. And that was one. And the other one is the idea that you will eventually be challenged to exceed your programming. And that we will all come to a point in our lives, maybe multiple times, where in order to accomplish something, to survive something, we may have to change the way that we think about things. And that's hard, but it's also something that's good. Inevitably, I hate change. I'm a normal person. I think normal people hate change. And in moments where I've been forced to change, I've never looked back at those without being just so grateful for them. And it became this really interesting thing that as I worked on the story, Roz looks at the animal's behavior and puts it in terms that she understands. So right after Fink says that, she says, "You're programming." Um, and she says that about a few characters. So she's putting things in terms that she understands. And of course, there's this moment that is from the book where she has a talk with these animals in the midst of this winter storm at a turning point in the story that if they don't change the way they work, no one is going to survive this winter. It's a wonderful thing, and it was a wonderful thing because we never had to like really like put it out there, like really pound people over the head with it. Story-wise, it was just so woven in to the narrative. So yeah, so those two things, I think it was just one of those things like, yeah, that's it. That's our North Star.
I want to come back to exceeding your programming, but first I'm curious, like, what were you seeing in the real world at the time, Chris? And what are you perhaps seeing right now in a month of huge political upheaval and fires decimating LA? What are you seeing that underlines for you the sense that, yes, maybe kindness and maybe community, these things are all we have? And yeah, I'd just be curious to know what reaffirms your belief from the real world that kindness can help us survive.
I think that there has never been, as a kid, you're not paying attention to things, but I think by the time that, I was old enough to really like watch the news and see what's going on, there's always a situation, I think, where people, if they don't know the what's going on with somebody else, it's easy to see them in a certain way, if that makes sense. So I don't think there's a time where there's ever not, or I would say there's never a time where this message wouldn't be pertinent. Um, um, I know that like, just yeah. Even people I've known, right? I'm like, like when I've spent time with them, you get that they're struggling with things as much as you are. And if you take a moment, if you take a moment and can calm down and just wait a beat, you'll see commonalities. And I think that, that it's always been around. These kind of stresses. They change, they come in, they increase and they decrease and stuff like that. But yeah, it's just I think the way that we're getting back to programming, I think that it's the way that we're programmed. I would say that I'm just again, I'm very much like everybody else. I want to simplify things. And when I simplify things, I might make mistakes about judging things, maybe judging people. And if you're willing to like look at the more complex stuff, right? Um, that's when you start to see commonalities and understand things. So I think that there's just such a hopeful message built into the story that Peter wrote.
That kind of message of togetherness, that's something that there's a long history of togetherness being explored in kids' books and kids' media. But one thing that is unique to this film, and that I've been thinking a lot about since seeing the film, is how, like, a lot of parents presumably came away from this film having to have a conversation with their kids because the world of the wild robot is so very clearly our world, as signposted by shots of, like, the whales swimming over a submerged Golden Gate Bridge. But the film doesn't explain why the Earth has undergone such drastic change. It doesn't explain why humans now seem to live in these pod cities separate from nature. And I can only imagine how many kids came out of screenings asking their parents, what happened? So, yeah, I'm curious, Chris. Did you leave that question unanswered in the film because you wanted that exact conversation to take place? Like, is there something more powerful in the film activating that question for young audiences to have in a way that, they have to talk about, like, after the credits roll, that is just more useful, or instigates something that you wouldn't have if there was like a text explainer at the beginning of the film?
I think the parts of the film that I was very conscious that were going to start conversation were primarily the questions of uh, existence and mortality. We asked, getting back to the conversation we had with Peter at the very beginning, we were asking him, is there a certain time period? Is there a certain place? Because he never identified them in the book. And he said, there's no exact place, but it's clearly the northwest coast of North America, just because of the animals and the topography. And likewise, there was no specific time. It's simply sometime in the future. And the reason that we did the whole thing with the Golden Gate Bridge was a very practical thing. We were worried that people wouldn't understand that it was Earth, because human beings are not represented very much in the story. And because robots dominate and animals dominate, we thought, if we're going to show that it's the future, how can we do that economically in very few shots? So we came up with the idea of the bridge that was underwater. There's no mistaking that that's planet Earth. That did not play well with kids in San Francisco. I got, I was definitely grilled by one child in San Francisco, who called that out. But yeah, there was a very practical reason that we showed those things. And again, Peter never really identified a time. He just said in the future. So the way that I was thinking about it, as a screenwriter, was that when I was in Hawaii once, I went snorkeling, and we were next to this sunken crater. And I remember they said, you can snorkel anywhere you want, but don't touch that island. That's a wildlife sanctuary. If we catch you walking on the island, you're going to be in big trouble. And that was the way that I was looking at it as a screenwriter. That, um, again, primarily because in the book, robots are sent to retrieve raws. So it is heavily suggested that it's a no-go zone for human beings. Um, it's a thriving island, so there's nothing about it that's dangerous as far as like the atmosphere. So I began to think of it as perhaps it's like a wildlife like sanctuary to some degree, that it has, for some reason, people have decided leave these places alone. Maybe they're letting them recover. I don't know. But that's what I was thinking in my head, is that people have moved away from the wilderness and have concentrated in places and then abandoned other places.
So obviously, Peter didn't specify a lot of this, which left it to you and left it to the animators to kind of like build this world on screen, and you almost had to do it from scratch in some senses. Did you have to have an understanding of the timelines of the catastrophes? Did you have to follow a certain science of what is predicted to happen, and if like the Arctic shelf collapses and all that kind of thing, in order to build what we see on screen, Chris?
We did do a bit of research as to like rising levels of rising ocean levels to see what coastlines would look like, because we were there were different opportunities that we could have exploited. One of them was, during the migration, should the birds set down at some point in what looks like a wilderness, and then we cut a little bit wider and it's an old stadium, like a football stadium that has like been allowed to like go back to nature. Um, and it ended up that we only had time for a few things. So we have the remnants of a city that is underwater. We have the bridge underwater, and then at one point, if you're watching, it's a nighttime shot as the geese are flying overhead, and there are some big radio telescopes, and they're in disrepair. So again, I think just suggesting that people have for some reason relocated themselves. No suggestion as to why. And because nothing story-wise hung on that, we only had to go so far in defining it. Um, yeah, so we went as far as we needed to. And then to a certain degree, let people fill in those gaps in the details by themselves.
And on the note of that football stadium, what else can you tell me about like the ideas, the imagery that you kind of kicked around at the beginning of this project that perhaps wasn't in this book, that perhaps existed in an outline or even in a first draft that you ended up parking because it didn't serve the narrative? I'd love to hear just all the ideas or any of the ideas that come to mind that you were excited to put in, but it ultimately wasn't the right thing for the wild robots.
We designed a ship that was a container ship. Um, I had a more detailed opening where it was more step by step. The first script, we actually start in the factory where Roz is being made and she's being assembled. And we very quickly, but in a fair amount of detail, showed her being completed, packaged, loaded on a ship, and that ship runs into a storm and we see the containers fall overboard. Um, and at a certain point, we were like, we don't have we only have so much time, and can we jettison that because we need that time for other things? But also, it was really good for the story. We realized maybe it's better to start this film when Roz boots up, so that everyone, the audience, is there with her. So it's much more palpable and immediate. So there was definitely an opening that we experimented with and then jettisoned. What else? I mean, there was definitely uh, I experimented with a few sequences where one of the characters that was removed is named Chit Chat. It is a very, very popular character in the book because Chit Chat talks a lot. So when kids read the book or parents read the book to kids, it is a really fun part of the book to read. It was one of the most popular characters that I knew I had to remove just because Chit Chat is like a little kid, befriends Bright Bill when he meets him, and they spend time together. And again, I had to clear out time. Um, a book is a boat. It can hold a lot. You can digest a book at your own pace. Think of it as a container ship. Um, but a film is an airplane. It only has a certain amount of time to get to where it's going. It needs to be lightweight. It needs to be fast. It needs to be streamlined. So for that reason, you jettison a lot of things to make room on the airplane for the things that are just very, very necessary. And you only have time, especially in animation, for those things that are absolutely necessary. And the art of it is to make it feel very natural, to make it feel as though it's not missing anything, and to not reveal like if you've never read the book, you wouldn't notice these things had been missing. I would say at this point, one of the interesting things would be if you have seen the film and you have not read the book, it's a really wonderful thing to read the book and just get back in touch with the actual source material. Yeah,
That's so interesting about the opening of the film because, well, it is really unusual. The film throws us into that disorientation, and we get a sense of this world of ecological disaster immediately. There's a tsunami wave crashing towards our protagonist, and we don't know who they are yet, but we know that they're presented with all the threats of the forest immediately. In fact, like right up until the kind of grizzly bear attack, this thing is 100 miles per hour, and it's almost like the Revenant-esque in terms of like the all angles assault on Roz with new dangers at every turn. So that is such an opening, and I think to your point, like it really kind of adds to the sense of poignancy when Roz says that heartbreaking line, "Did anyone order me?" There's a sense of just yeah that line doesn't I don't think the audience would sort of feel that line the way that we do without that opening where we're sitting in her confusion and her terror. That is such a particular moment of loneliness in the film, and it really sets up like that character not just from a narrative perspective, like we know in that moment that she craves purpose, but it also seems to announce something about the character. Can you tell me about that line, Chris? Did anyone order me?
yeah, absolutely. In the book, she's really searching for two things. She's looking for whoever, frankly, just in a very practical way. She's looking for whoever ordered her, because a Rosm robot, as described in the book, and Peter was telling us as well, is designed to complete tasks. And they are very, very they're learning robots, so they're very adaptable. So I love to look at things the way they really might be, because that's what gives a story, I think, some believability. So, a long time ago, they sold this like little thing. It was a package, and if you opened it up, there were, I think, about 12 folded up pieces of paper that when you unfolded them, they were the blueprints for the Starship Enterprise. And I saved my money and bought them because I looked at those things every day. I like carefully unfold them because I wanted to know how the Enterprise worked. And I've always done that. On Lilo and Stitch, I wrote a very detailed description about why the red ship worked the way it did. And I had arrows pointing to parts of the ship because I did the drawing of the ship, but then I identified all the parts and what they did. So I was very interested in Roz operating the way she really would. Like I thought, she's expensive. She has these exterior lights that would constantly, like if you had a manual for why she worked, like you get the robot, you get a manual, and the manual says when the lights go green, this is what it means. When this light blinks at this frequency, it means that this needs, service and stuff like that. So I was looking at her as a real product. So when she can't find her operator, she goes into this promotional mode because I thought, okay, they would build in a promotional mode so that she would advertise herself, and perhaps like another customer might buy one because that sounds pretty good. So she gives out stickers, which is something that I came up with when she can't find her operator. Um, so that moment was meant to really focus on the fact that she's like, I like that she said, "Did anybody order me?" Because she's a product. So at the end of the film, when this other robot shows up. Roz, by that point, has become a very, very real being to us. And it was very important for me that this robot that shows up, Vantra, is like touching Roz. It feels very violating, but Roz is like a lawnmower to this company. She's like a refrigerator. So this robot that shows up, it does not see Roz as a living being, an individual. It's a lawnmower that isn't working right. She's touching her and she's, looking her up and down and just treating her in this really weird way that was meant to make everybody feel uncomfortable.
You know, it occurred to me the first time I watched it, I wondered if Roz was going to be this piece of technology that's outlived its human creators in that particular moment that we're describing. It's not till much later on in the film that we get a sense of like, oh no, humans are still around. It is a likelihood in the real world that, the internet, for example, will outlive humans. That's something that's agreed upon amongst scientists. But instead, of course, like the gradual reveal of the film is that she's a product of Universal Dynamics, as you say, that company is still going. Can you break down for me how you understood what that company is and any different iterations of that company and its kind of maliciousness, I suppose?
Yeah, and it was important to me that that it Bontra plays the role of a villain at that point. So she occupies that space. And by the third act of the film, you can take leaps that you wouldn't be able to take in the first two acts. So I was able to, and one of the reasons that Vantra behaves in a more sort of broad way, again, wasn't necessarily to make her a villain. It was because I needed her to occupy that space. In fact, I wrote into the script. Roz even says, "You seem happy." And she says, "I am programmed to put my targets at ease," because she's acting odd for a robot, right? So the idea that she's been programmed to behave this way because her role, one of her roles, is perhaps to hunt down a robot in this particular situation. I thought a lot about universal dynamics, and primarily I want the future world to be that hopeful, positive place that I was promised as a kid. We based it on Sid Mead paintings, which always presented this really, when I was a kid, the future was really exciting. Like the future was just going to get better and better and better. There was going to be Formica instead of wood. Like that's great. You know, and all these things are happening. And the future was just going to get better and better and better. And nowadays, I think that people see that as kind of a corny thing, but I still long for that. And I wanted primarily future world to be just the opposite of the island. So, and that was pretty simple. If the island is chaos, it's open to the elements, there's no even ground, then where Roz was supposed to be is harmonious. It's been well thought through. She would fit in there perfectly. Everything's level. There's a harmony to the way things fit together. So primarily, it's a really good place. It's just the fact that she's gone off script that it feels malevolent towards her because primarily they're frightened of her. And that's another thing I spent a lot of time thinking about. If you look at the film very carefully, the lights on Roz indicate not just her power level, but they indicate her level of distress. So when the bear hits her, from the very the moment the bear hits her, all of her running lights go bright red. So she's in distress. If you watch Vantra very closely, anytime Vantra drifts into a position where Roz can see her, she's green and she's trying to make Roz calm. But the moment she drifts outside of Roz's view, she goes bright red because she's frightened of Roz and she's distressed. So she's recognizing that Roz needs to be kept calm. But universal dynamics in general is, in my mind, is extremely concerned with what happened, which is why we can believe they sent a ship of that scale to retrieve her. I would imagine that a Roslyn robot is like an iPod or an iPad or an iPhone. That's $1 trillion industry to Universal Dynamics. And for one of these robots to go so badly off script would be very, very bad for them. So they need to get Roz back because they need to understand why she's operating by herself. In my mind, if she couldn't find an operator, she should have quickly defaulted to return mode, which she does, but she gets delayed because things happen. But at that point, she shouldn't have been operational. And the fact that they find her covered in lichens and she's obviously been doing things, that should be like a huge no-no as far as, or she should have been quietly sitting under a tree, gathering dust, shut down. That's what she was supposed to do. But she didn't shut down and they don't know why.
Something you said there about how like the future world was supposed to be the opposite of, the natural world. That kind of manifests on screen in the animation. And you'll have to excuse me, Chris, I'm a screenwriter, I'm not an animator, so I definitely won't have the vocabulary for this. But it seems, even in one frame, like at the beginning of the film, there's something kind of multidisciplinary going on in terms of the art styles. Like the natural world is kind of painted almost in these watercolors, and then there's more photorealism to Roz. Can you tell me, was that in the script? Unless I've completely imagined it, was that in the script?
Oh, yeah, you're very observant. So everything in the film is painted by a human hand. It's a return to when I started in animation because technology finally got to that point, which we could talk about in more detail. But the one lone element that is traditional CG is Roz and her crate when she first activates. We have 30 versions of her that we begin to trade out almost immediately because the more time she spent, and you're completely correct, we deliberately want her to look like she doesn't belong where she is. So visually, she doesn't fit. So the language of her surfacing is completely different. Then we begin to trade her out, 30 versions of her until we get to the midpoint of the film, and she has a 100% painted surface, just like the animals do. We're still trying to evoke the materials that she's made of, titanium and different polymers, but they're painted now. So she gets more organic. And then, of course, by the time Vantra shows up, she looks like a chia pet. She's got moss. She's got little flowers growing on herself. And again, the way we staged it, she stepped, like Vantra says, she introduces herself and Roz steps into a pool of light and she's fully illuminated. And that's meant to shock Vantra as far as how changed she is.
So another thing we haven't discussed yet, Chris, that I think is really important to this story is the idea of motherhood. So Roz obviously discovers this goose egg in a nest that she's accidentally destroyed. She then nurtures the egg till it hatches, and all of a sudden we have Bright Bill. That's kind of that's such a bulk of the film. And it's interesting, like I'm curious, like what you saw as so fitting about these two things the film's exploring, like yes, ecological collapse, but also motherhood. What kind of locked in for you about those two things together?
Um, there were these wonderful things that were suggested and not just there were things that were suggested that we latched onto that we developed, and there were things that were just flat out like load bearing pillars inside Peter's story. The biggest one being the idea that Roz takes on a task because she needs a task this one pretty much, falls in her lap, but she's taking on a task that very poetically, she doesn't understand where this is leading. Emotionally, she's headed towards a cliff and she's driving straight towards an emotional precipice, but she doesn't know it. Anybody who's grown up like I did, in Colorado and places with snow, who has built a snowman, knows that it'll always end badly, right? And so if you're raising a bird and you do a good job, it's going to fly away, but she doesn't understand that. Or she doesn't understand emotionally what that means. She's just like, well, this is a job. The other thing that was so beautiful about the story is that we had to deliberately build into Roz gaps. Um, we actually had discussions where people would say to us, well, of course she knows how to raise a Gosling. She knows everything. She's like an encyclopedia. And our answer was, she has to have gaps or the story won't work. So for some reason, they never programmed in this information. She then says it flat out, I'm not programmed to do this. And the beautiful thing about that is anybody who's had a child gets that moment. Like, that kid is unique. Everyone's like, even brothers and sisters inside the same family, they can be completely different. So you are not prepared. So when she says, I don't have the programming, everyone can relate to that. Also, story-wise, it forced her to go off script. And that's a big no-no for a Rosam robot. So at the midpoint of the film where she ends up talking to another robot, and it says, basically, what are you doing? She says, I don't know. I'm just making things up. And she's come to the point where she's just, she's having a crisis. And of course, for a Rosam robot, this is a big no-no, to go off script like that. But if she didn't, she couldn't have completed the mission. So we never say it, but at that moment, she has to make a decision. Do I scrap my programming and do what is forbidden, or do I fail in my mission? And she prioritizes the mission. She prioritizes Bright Bill's life. And it's just a beautiful thing that was built into the fabric of the story that we were able to exploit, and point out. So yeah, of course, I storyboarded the sequence where Bright Bill at the midpoint of the film does join this migration. And I was able to make physical that cliff emotionally. And so when Bright Bill disappears, in my mind, Roz's Roz's she didn't understand until that moment, and suddenly she's seized by something, and she does this illogical thing. She just starts to run. And now she's operating on pure emotion, and she runs because she has to see him one more time. And she ends up running right up to the edge of that cliff, which is embodied physically, hanging off the cliff to see if she can see him for one last moment. And that's something that I played a piece of music in my headset as I rode a bike, for weeks thinking about that sequence, until I had it down the way I wanted it. And then I sat down and I storyboarded it just once.
There's something interesting that's happening with Bright Bill in that moment as well. You've talked elsewhere, Chris, about how the scene in which Longneck talks to Bright Bill right before the geese are about to migrate. In that moment, he realizes, and I quote, "There's no longer time for him to apologize. There's no time left to make things right. This is something that I have experienced in my life, that I've waited too long to say something, and the regret I carry is huge." That sounds really emotional, and obviously this is a work of adaptation, but it sounds like you were still bringing parts of your own life to the table here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things I was able to, I guess, find, is this moment that Longneck lays down some very heavy stuff for Bright Bill. But there's, like, as you said, there's no time left for Bright Bill to process and deal with it. Because what Longneck tells him basically is, he turns everything around for Bright Bill and points out that Bright Bill has been blaming Roz for the death of his family, which to some degree is legitimate, even though it was an accident. But he points out that, and it was a feature of the story, Bright Bill is a runt. He was chosen by nature to not survive. But because Roz found him, he did. So at that moment that Longneck says, if it wasn't for this calamity, you wouldn't be here. He says, look at all these geese around you. Do you see any other geese your size? The accident that killed your family saved you. Um, and there isn't time for Bright Bill now to catch up and and deal with that and apologize. And that bit of reconciliation, we deliberately timed it to happen at that moment so that Bright Bill, so that unsaid thing powers the film for the rest of for the other half of the film, because we're waiting for a chance for Bright Bill to get back and talk to her. But she has no intention of being there. So there's all these wonderful, complex things that are going on, which is why I love stories like this, because these are the kind of calamities that we are going to experience and do experience and have experienced, that we dwell on and think about. And like, if only I'd had more time, if only I'd known this a day before, if only I'd said something. So absolutely, there's things that, I could, you know, talk about that I could, um, yeah.
I don't know, it's not my place to ask what the regret is or was, but the kind of present tense of that quote, the regret I carry is huge. It's still active. I'm curious, like, Chris, did adding that into the film and making it part of the Wild Robot, did it kind of resolve that regret for you in some way? Does it feel emotional to see that scene, given that's a part of your own life clearly that you're putting into the film?
By nature, it can't be resolved. For me, it was, my own mom that, um, when I was very, very young, she was she was diagnosed with cancer when she was pregnant with my sister, and she could have chemo or she could carry my sister full term. And this is something I didn't really understand as a kid. And she prioritized my my sister. Um, and that may have been the thing that meant that she didn't live much longer after that. So I didn't know her very well. And I quite honestly don't know if I ever told her I loved her. I think I did once, but in my family, we're not very demonstrative, for whatever. But it's yeah, for that was something that I thought about. So for me, the actual poignant moment was, when Fink says, "When you grow up without something, you spend a lot of time thinking about it." And that was a story point that we talked about a lot, because some people saw that and said, well, this is out of character for Fink. And I would defend it very vehemently and say, no, 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 no. This is not an inconsistency of his character. This is him revealing a new layer of himself. And it makes perfect sense. It's why he is the way he is. So for me, that was the moment. Oddly enough, it's when he says that. It's not the Bright Bill moment. It's actually the Fink moment. Um, and for me, I that's when I get very emotional, just watching the film and seeing that moment come to life. And when he's waiting and trying to talk to Roz as the island is shutting down for the winter, for me, that's the other big moment. Um, because he's so anxious to talk to her, and she's lost in thought about Bright Bill, but he's desperate for connection with her. And 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 she says, "How do you know if you love someone?" And he says, "Well, you should probably tell them," because he hopes that he'll hear it from her, right? And then that's another missed opportunity. And she says, "What if it's too late?" And he realizes, oh, she's not talking about me. And he says, I wouldn't know." And then in the next moment, he's vanished. So when he goes to bed, he doesn't go to sleep. He just lays there with his eyes open. So there's a lot of pain, built into this whole thing. Um, for sure. But I don't, it's not a sad movie. It's an affirming movie. I think that you've got to have those boundaries. I would say I describe it as a playground. Like, you need to put fences up and find your boundaries so that you can go right up to the edge and play these things and let them breathe. And you do this because the moment that Fink does understand that she's his friend, that's why you do it, because you need that tension. You need that emotional ballast.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Chris. That's really beautiful, and I think, like, as an aside, like, this film will encourage people to say the thing before it's too late, and I think that's going to be a beautiful legacy of this film. We should talk about the ending, Chris. It's incredibly bittersweet. I know there are some slight deviations from the novel, but you leave things open for sequels in the way that the original novel did, which of course later had two further films. Can you tell me about, like, constructing sort of the final act of this film, and any kind of dilemmas you had as you came to this point in the film, and were trying to land the plane? We've spoken a lot about planes in this conversation. Was it a tricky one to get right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the very beginning of the film and the very, very end were the two that were boarded the most as we searched for the right balance. There's a comedy battle when the robots try to catch Roz, and we need that catharsis and that fun, so that we can just relax and have, cheer, right? But then we also have to recognize that there's a moment between Bright Bill and Roz, and literally figuring out where Roz would be. This is where I give so much credit to these. That's where I started. That's where I stay. I still do storyboarding. I will always consider myself a story artist primarily. And one of my story artists kept pointing out, Andy, he said, "You have her getting on the ship twice." And he's like, "I just feel like that's too complex." And he was always pointing it out, very gently, but very insistently saying, "You're getting this wrong." And there came a day where I was like, you know what? He's absolutely right. I rethought the way the choreography would work, so that and that was how the solve was that, and it was a good solve, I think. Again, full credit to Andy, where Roz, because she thinks there's nothing left for her, she doesn't know Bright Bill has come back. She's willing to get on the ship. I had her fully get on the ship, but then I engineered the bit where she interrupts that and makes a run for it. And she was this close to being captured, right? She was close, but she ran off. And it was so much better. Full credit again to Andy and to Heidi Jo Gilbert, my head of story, for keeping after me about that. Because I kept like, no, no, it's going to work. I can figure this out. And I had to confess to myself, no, it's not working. Something's wrong. And that moment of like realization that yeah, she should only get on the ship. So that re-engineered everything. And it was like, oh my God, this is a beautiful thing, because when she does finally get pulled against her will up into the ship, now there's only one character that can reach her, and that's Bright Bill, because he can fly. So suddenly the landscape and the engineering, the structure worked. We could have the animals on the ground left behind, and we had this beautiful setup so that we could have that resolution in a private space in a stressful moment. And Bright Bill was all alone because he's the only one that could finally reach her. And you look at it now and you're like, well, it's simple. Why didn't you do that in the first place, right? Um, but sometimes it takes a while to find that. Again, it was really hard because there's a lot of things you could do at the end.
Yeah, well, it's a brilliant ending. Speaking of endings, we are running out of time, Chris, but I want to ask one more question before I do. And it's kind of along the lines of, like, climate fiction, because I think this is one of the most pronounced examples of mass market climate fiction, or cli-fi as they call it. Obviously, like, great films have existed before that have grappled with the climate crisis, but they're usually smaller productions. They weren't big family event movies the way the Wild Robot was. And obviously, yes, other movies fold climate crisis adjacent ideas into their films, but usually through metaphor. So it really is just this film and Wall-E that have kind of dared to tackle it head on. What's your advice for screenwriters who are horrified by what they're seeing and they want to make art that mobilizes people into action on a mass scale, but these films obviously still need to entertain? How do you thread that needle successfully?
I think by not hitting it too hard, by not because people get it, uh, coming at it maybe more sideways, and again, like it's it's a concept that is in a lot of ways not hard to understand. So it's one of the things I think that we were able to do in this film is there's a lot of different things that are there's a lot of heavy things going on, and we were able to weave them into the story, and make it feel just like part of the fabric of the story, um, so that you're not driving into it like head on and really really like hammering it too loud and hard. Um, because I think that allowing people to empathize and connect with the characters, you're able to drive them through situations so that you're feeling it from the inside. Um, is the best way to go. I tend to I tend to have, and there's another, it's like related to what we were talking about before. I tend to avoid things in my real life. It's hard for me to, like, if I know somebody and I see them coming, I generally go the other direction. I don't know why. I sort of I tend to approach story points and write things the way I live my life. I kind of veer past them and touch on them and then keep going, instead of grabbing them and confronting them, you know. So I think it worked well, I think, in Mulan, and it worked like well here because it just, and so and so there's moments where you do stop and really grapple with something. It becomes really resonant if you are more gentle with it for the most part. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I also now know, Chris, to not be offended if I'm walking towards you on the street and you cross the road. That's fine.
It's not personal. It's not personal. I don't know why. And then later on, I'm like, why did I do that? Like, I can't even tell you. I can't tell you how many times I sit around like days and weeks later, and I'm like, like, I worked at Disney for, 20 years, and I'm too shy to ask people for a drawing. And I was there. I worked every day next to Glenn Keane and other artists, and I'm like, why didn't I? Could you do me a drawing? And I'm like, no, no, I'll do that. I'll do that someday. I'll do that later. I'll do that someday. And then you're like, you know what? Look at the time. You're like, you know.
That's kind of the message of this movie. Chris, this has been such a fascinating 45 minutes. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for this film, and good luck in awards season.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.